It is May 6, 2025, and Romania is in the middle of its second attempt at a presidential election after the last version was canceled and its top contender, Călin Georgescu, was banned from running again. Now, why did they ban him? Well, among other things, he has been incredibly critical of the NATO alliance. Now, granted, he has also said that he's pro-Trump, so I guess you can fit that in there, but he has been critical of NATO, critical of funding for Ukraine, and that's not something that the EU and NATO were too excited about, given the fact that Romania is their choice for NATO's largest military base in Europe. Notable given the fact that it's right there on the Black Sea and right next to Ukraine. So now you have the second round, and you have the top contender who is a close ally of Georgescu. However, while he is also far right, he's dropping the criticism of NATO. Now, I should mention that all of these guys are incredibly pro-Israel. Georgescu said that he would be happy to invite Netanyahu for a visit and to just completely ignore the International Criminal Court warrant for his arrest, but that's another story for another time. And all of this also comes as Germany today has a new chancellor, but not until he was hit with a historic defeat in the first round vote that he lost by just 6 votes, despite the fact that his coalition has the majority. So what does all of this mean for where Europe is headed and for their overall support for this ongoing proxy war against Russia? We got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is George Simion, an author, geopolitical analyst, and senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. George, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's very nice to be with you again, Rachel.
Yeah, it's good to have you on the show. Now, I want to start out with the latest on this election that is being held right now in Romania, because it has been 5 months since the original vote was canceled and Călin Georgescu was banned from running over allegations of Russian interference, and now his close ally, George Simion, just won the first round of voting, and Simion is the candidate who is far right, has been critical of the EU's energy and immigration policies, as well as sending weapons to Romania's neighbor, Ukraine. Were you surprised to see George Simion won over 40% of the vote in the first round?
No, I wasn't surprised because there is clearly a very bad feeling about what happened with Georgescu. I mean, as you pointed out, last December, he won the first round of the voting. The second round had already started. He was clearly on track to win that second round. And the Supreme Court of Romania stepped in and canceled the election. I mean, it was such an outrage. It was almost breathtaking in its contempt for democracy. It was, of course, endorsed by Brussels. It was endorsed by Washington. That was still the Biden administration. And then they said, okay, well, they came up with this ridiculous story about Russian interference. They presented no evidence. They just thought, oh, there was this campaign on TikTok and whatever, but that still didn't answer the question. Well, but Romanians went out and voted for him. Whatever happened on TikTok, they still went and voted for him. So I said, oh, we're going to do it over. And then, of course, well, what happened with Georgescu said, okay, well, I'll run in the do-over. And then the authorities stepped in, arrested him, and declared that he was ineligible to run in this in the do-over. So he wasn't able to run. Now, Simion is, he also ran in December, but he came fourth. He didn't do particularly well. What he did was identify himself totally with Georgescu. So they campaigned together. They were always seen together. And even on election day, on Sunday, they went and voted together. So he was clearly making clear that there's no daylight between Georgescu and myself. Now, I think there is a difference between the two. I think Simion, at least as far as his background is concerned, we don't know yet exactly how he's going to govern. I imagine he'll win the presidency. When I say he'll govern, I think he will probably win. He's got 41%, so he doesn't need that many more votes to get over the 50% mark. But he is an ethno-nationalist, which is not quite what Georgescu was. And what that means is that he does have issues with other national groups in Romania, and in particular with the Hungarians. He is no friend of the Hungarians. I mean, as you know, there is a very substantial Hungarian minority in Romania. Simion has been a very strongly opponent of the Hungarians. He's opposed to the Hungarians having their own ethnically based political party. He has very poor relations as a result with Viktor Orban's Hungary. So I don't see too much of an alliance forming between Hungary and Romania. And then he has these views about Romania being restored to its pre-1940 borders. My view is that Brussels can work with him better than it can work with Georgescu, because he's not really asserting kind of Romanian independent sovereignty or an independent Romanian foreign policy in the way that Georgescu was. He's pro-NATO. He hasn't said anything against NATO. He says, he wants to make NATO stronger. He wants to increase Romania's contribution to NATO. He's very much identifying himself with Trump. He's on the Trumpian wing of NATO. His hero is Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister. And why would your hero be Giorgia Meloni? Well, Meloni is a very pragmatic person. I mean, she came to the power. Everyone was very excited that there was going to be some major changes in NATO land following Meloni's victory in the Italian election. And then nothing much changed. I mean, she just was very, played along with Brussels. So I kind of think that Brussels can work with ethno-nationalism. I don't think they can work with sovereign nationalism. I mean, when you think of ethno-nationalism, look at the Baltic states. I mean, the Baltic states, they're in good odor with Brussels, and they pursue the most outrageous, discrimination against their own people, against the Russians who have lived there for generations. And this is in violation of all the international covenants of human rights and so on. Brussels had no problem with it. No problem at all that they kick Russians out and say, hey, well, you don't speak Estonian well enough, so you're not entitled to Estonian citizenship. So you go pack your bags. This is the worst kind of ethnic discrimination, but Brussels has no problem with that. So I think that's why Simion may not be such a problem for Brussels as Georgescu threatened to be.
Okay, and that's interesting. I appreciate you bringing that up, because I feel like a lot of the reports that I've read, especially here in the Western media, have taken these two politicians and acted as though they're one and the same. And as you're pointing it out there, I'm going, it's interesting how the targeting of Georgescu, right, his arrest, saying, oh, you can't run in the elections, and the way that he was clearly targeted, and then the EU just goes, oh yeah, whatever, it's Russian interference, as is all too easy for them to claim without providing any legitimate evidence. That's almost kind of covered up now. And they want to say like, oh yeah, we got this new guy. He's far right. He's banned from both Ukraine and Moldova. So clearly he's not making friends with his neighbors. But at the same time, that's a little bit of a cover up of what the people actually wanted initially, that now the EU is coming in and telling them, you can't have this.
Right. No, this is a very tried and true tactic in NATO and the EU. They pretend, whoa, this guy's a real nationalist. We're really scared of him. We don't want to have anything to do with him. He's the real deal. And then it turns out that he is nobody. I mean, they did that in Yugoslavia when they moved in and overthrew Milosevic and replaced him by Kostunica. And so, oh, Kostunica, he is a real nationalist. Boy, we're really afraid of him, because he's really going to stand up for Serbia's interests. Of course, he didn't stand up for Serbia's interests at all. And they do this all the time to create a kind of a phony nationalist and then pretend that this is the real threat to us. I don't know whether he will turn out to be a phony nationalist. I would say that his track record, there's nothing here that would suggest that he's in any way an opponent of NATO's, that he's going to really stand in the way of the NATO agenda. He's talking about making NATO stronger, very much, as I said, identifying with Trump. And what's happening in Romania now is that the United States is building its biggest military base in Europe in Romania. Now he hasn't said, "Well, I think we're going to close it down." I don't think we're going to do that. And that's the point. Romania is a key transportation hub for delivery of arms to Ukraine. He hasn't said that he's going to stand in the way of that. He has emerged only. He's sort of basking in the sort of the shadow of Georgescu, pretending that he's that we're inseparable. But there's nothing in his past that would indicate that he is really going to stand up against NATO and the EU.
Okay, and that's good to know because I feel like that's coverage that I'm not seeing, at least in kind of the mainstream media and how they're presenting this. They're trying to, again, present them as one and the same. All right, so we've got the second round of voting coming up on May 18th. And the latest update is that Romania's prime minister has announced his resignation and effectively disbanded the country's pro-EU ruling coalition. So between now and May 18th, what are you keeping an eye on when it comes to the state of things in Romania? Is a lot of this for show, or is this real chaos going on when it comes to their government and the makeup of it?
Well, now he's up against a kind of a liberal, anti-corruption, activist. This is a kind of all-purpose, ubiquitous term. The mayor of Bucharest. Now, probably, if Brussels had a choice, they would prefer Dan, the mayor of Bucharest, to win, and they might, get involved and start providing him with support. But it's very unlikely that it'll be enough. I mean, we've got Simion, he's got 41%. He only needs another 10% really to get him over the top. There are clearly nationalists who ran in the vote on Sunday, who are going to switch their votes to Simion. I don't see Dan really having much of a shot at winning. So what I would think will happen is that Brussels is going to put out feelers to Simion, already to make clear that, hey, we want to work with you. So just knock it off. At the moment, Simion is promising, well, I'm going to appoint Georgescu as prime minister. Well, if your hero is Maloney, then I don't know. That the whole point of Maloney is that she really avoids any confrontations at all with Brussels. For Simion to appoint Georgescu as prime minister, that would be a real a source of a bone of contentions with Brussels. So I don't really believe it. I think he's using Georgescu to win this election, and it's worked for him. As I say, last December he came fourth, didn't really distinguish himself in any particular way. He's suddenly this overwhelming victor for one reason only, because he has absolutely identified himself with Georgescu.
Yeah, he's figured out that between Georgescu and Trump, he's good to go. Now, I do want to ask you about politics and another part of Europe, because we did have this update today that Friedrich Merz is now the next chancellor in Germany officially after a second round of voting that was held on Tuesday. But that, of course, comes after his historic defeat in the first round by just 6 votes, despite the fact that his coalition holds the majority. And I want to ask you, how do you view the current state of tensions in Germany? I know we've been talking about the AfD and this rightward push that we're seeing all throughout Europe, but how do you see it as it stands right now with Merz at the helm taking over for one Olaf Scholz? I guess we don't get to make fun of him anymore, so there's that.
No, that's a shame. The remarkable thing about the election was that both the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats did very, very badly. The Social Democrats suffered a historic defeat, their worst ever performance. This is the oldest, most distinguished Social Democratic Party in Europe. They kind of started social democracy in Europe. Their ancestry goes back to the days of Bismarck, when Bismarck outlawed the German Social Democratic Party. They got, I think, 16% of the vote. Christian Democrats did also very, very poorly, and yet they're in government. And you think, well, if you get rejected by the voters, how come you're in the government? And that's what has been pulled on Germany. I think Germans are not very happy about it. And then on top of that, during this interim period, they pulled a stunt whereby they changed the constitution about the debt break, so to enable the new German government to spend lavishly based on debt on defense or on their military. Now, Germans tend to be quite sensitive on the subject of excessive spending, particularly if it's on debt, because they think, hey, that's inflationary. Inflation is not really good. We've had a bad experience with inflation. We had that in the 1920s and we got Hitler. So Germans are sensitive on that. And this is what happened during this interim period. So in a way, it was already an outrage that this was done before the new government even took over. So in other words, they have the debt break, means that any additional debt that the government runs up for defense spending doesn't count as part of the national debt. So that was the key thing that they had to change, the debt break, so that this doesn't really count as debt, even though obviously it is debt. So what Merz is already tanking in the polls, and then after the election, having promised that he's really going to tighten the borders, and Germany is not going to be open to mass immigration. Very, very sore point also in Germany. He immediately changed his mind the very day after the election. And said, "Well, I know I said we're going to close the border, but you don't want to take what I said literally." Well, the result is that now the Alternative for Deutschland Party is leading in the polls. They're ahead of the Christian Democrats. So what happened today with that vote, when he lost, this is historic. It's never happened that a chancellor failed to win the majority in the Bundestag. It just shows the unpopularity. And I don't think he's going to recover from this, because I think this government is going to continue tanking in the polls. I think this whole idea of spending huge amounts of money on a military that Germany doesn't need, whipping up hysteria about a Russian threat to Germany that Germans don't believe and don't want to go down that path. They really, really don't want to go to war with Russia. He's just, and of course you've got this continuing immigration problem. I think its government is dead on arrival. I think that this is going to be a very unpopular government, as unpopular as the traffic light coalition that lost out. And I would expect that the coalition probably will fall apart, and that there will be elections in the not too distant future.
Wow. And yeah, it's one of those situations where, as you're describing it, it's like, hey, the parties that the people voted for or didn't vote for, all of a sudden they always seem to end up back in power. It's funny how that
Always,
happens.
yeah, exactly.
And yet they're the ones who are preaching so much about democracy. Now, while I have you on, I do want to ask you about the latest concerning the war in Ukraine, as we obviously have tensions there and kind of bringing the US into it, because the Trump administration all of a sudden seems to be on board as Washington and Kiev signed off on this long awaited so called minerals deal last week that will see the US really continue the provision of lethal aid to Ukraine, but it will be rebranded as part of quote unquote reconstruction efforts. Now, we've heard Trump say for so long that he wants to end this war. He has initiated talks with Russia, but we're not seeing any actual ending the war in Ukraine. So, how do you view what Trump is doing versus what he's saying when it comes to Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I think Trump is in a very awkward position. I really do believe that he wants to end this war. I don't think he sees it as his war. I think when he says it's Biden's war, I think he really does believe it's Biden's war. I mean, he did contribute something with the javelins, but that wasn't, relative to what Obama did in supporting the Maidan coup, and then relative to what Biden did by essentially giving the green light to Ukraine's entry into NATO, and then going all in to support, actually signing off on bombing targets inside Russia itself. So relative to that, the javelins, he sent them at a time when it was still a low-level conflict. I think his contribution is quite small. But Trump really, if you look at the political landscape in Washington, there aren't really too many figures in Washington, either on Capitol Hill or in the think tank world, in the media, among the policymakers who want out. So while I think Trump says, well, I think we should end this war, there aren't really too many takers. And so I think he wants to end. I think he wants to end the American involvement, but he kind of has a problem on his hands. I mean, he can of course do what people suggest he should do, and probably what he should do, which is to cut Ukraine off altogether. But this would be a very unpopular thing for him to do. I mean, he's going to be attacked within his own party. There's a sanctions against Russia coming up. This is being led by the Republicans, by his friend Lindsey Graham, and as they keep saying, it's veto proof. In other words, even if Trump wants to veto this new sanctions package against Russia, they've got the votes to override Trump. So I think Trump is just trying one thing and another, hoping that something can work out for him. The one thing he has said, which is quite interesting, and he's now repeated it several times, is I, Donald Trump, have prevented Russia from taking all of Ukraine. Now, it's very interesting to this formulation, because if he sticks to that line, he can essentially say, let Russia take the rest of the four oblasts. And then he can say, well, I saved the rest of Ukraine. Putin was going to take everything. I saved what's left of Ukraine. Now, people who attack him and say, but he provides a rationale for an American exit. He said, I saved Ukraine. And so therefore we didn't lose, we actually won. It's a way presidents do that. I mean, if you think about Nixon in Vietnam, Nixon changed the American goals from victory and democracy and whatever in South Vietnam and said, peace with honor. We got peace with honor. Didn't say we won, we got peace with honor. So if he can formulate something like that, I saved it. Putin wants to take the whole thing. I prevented him from doing so. That provides him with a way to American exit, and without looking too ridiculous. But it's going to be difficult. I mean, he's got a lot of opposition. As I say, he's got almost the entirety of the Republican Party in both houses. And then he's got the entire sort of Washington political establishment, the media establishment, all of whom are absolutely committed to Ukraine. And then you've got all these allies in NATO, all of whom want this war to continue. So if you think of Trump, where are his allies? Where are the people who are going to work with him? There aren't too many of them.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch too. I know that, the last thing I'll bring up is just kind of where the quote unquote deal stands, right? Because we saw Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. He goes, he meets with Russian President Putin. They have multiple meetings. And then he comes back and he's talking about these 5 regions. He's saying, look, Russia really requires the recognition of these regions. That's kind of like the bare minimum for a possible deal. And then when we see the reports that we've gotten on this deal in recent weeks, all of a sudden it just turns to the recognition of Crimea. And that's it. That's the only thing that's mentioned. And I think there was almost some fear, and there may still be, that the US is going to try to hand Russia the quote unquote deal of the century, right? That really is a Minsk 3 style deal that would freeze the conflict, but that they make it look like, hey, we're addressing all of your concerns, sign on to this deal, everything will be fine, and we'll end the war in Ukraine. But we're not even seeing the US do that. Instead, they're ignoring a lot of Russia's major concerns about, okay, how would this deal be imposed? What would this mean for NATO support for Ukraine? Are you surprised that we're not seeing the US do more, Trump do more to really try to work with Russia here when Russia has been willing to talk to them so much?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, I think it is a very difficult war to end. I mean, I think, yeah, he said that I'm going to end in 24 hours. It is very difficult. Well, you're right. I mean, to the extent that we got this 5-point plan, that was published by Reuters. It said that America would accept Crimea de jure, and then there would be in the 4 oblasts, the ceasefire lines would be drawn along the line of contact. Well, what does that mean? That means, first of all, that Russia hasn't achieved its wartime objectives. I mean, these 4 oblasts are supposed to be incorporated within the Russian Federation, so that hasn't happened. And then, of course, the part that you alluded to that is that, yeah, but then NATO will continue to arm Ukraine. And then NATO is going to continue to arm, train Ukraine, and NATO is going to start building bases in Ukraine, and then NATO is going to start installing missiles in Ukraine, and NATO is going to start installing anti-aircraft defense systems in Ukraine. Hey, you're preparing for the second round. I mean, you're just going to use this time, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, to restart the whole war. Obviously, that isn't acceptable. Now, with Witkoff, I mean, it's clear at least that Witkoff and Trump are at least thinking and saying, well, we have to, give them something. We can't just simply insist on this ridiculous position of the Biden administration and NATO of Ukraine returning to the 1991 borders, and that Russia will be defeated and Russia has to be pushed out of Ukraine. This is a nonsensical wartime objective. We can't possibly accomplish it unless we go to war. And of course, we're not going to go to war. There is no support for going to war. So therefore, what can we work with? I mean, I try to think that maybe, given that they've already reached this point, they've moved quite a long way from where Biden was, that they can just move a little bit further and say, okay, you've now accepted this. You now should accept that they're not going to go back to Minsk 3, then that there's going to have to be additional territory, I think the additional territory in the oblast, and then there would have to be serious talks about the disarmament of Ukraine and a break on any further NATO weapons for Ukraine. That's down the road, and so maybe they can still talk. I mean, Witkoff, I think he's a serious negotiator, and I think he, much more than almost anybody else in Washington, seems to understand the Russian position and understand where, what's required for a lasting agreement. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, I'm just saying that, that's a possibility, but who knows? There are very powerful forces that are determined that there be no agreement, and so I don't know whether this is going to succeed.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see what the Trump administration does try to pursue now that you have someone like Marco Rubio, who apparently is also the national security advisor as well as Secretary of State. And I'm looking at Rubio and going, I do not trust him. I don't
No,
trust his
not
new
at all. But no,
rebrand. And yet he tries to present himself as someone who's like, oh, yeah, I'm all for the multipolar world. And I'm like,
oh
you
yeah,
don't
yeah.
say that when you represent the US and when you represent all of the
Rubio
neocon.
is absolutely. Rubio is he's a very smooth operator. I mean, he's got onto saying Trumpian things. He's learned how to say Trumpian things. He was always the neocon's neocon. However, there's speculation that the national security advisor will be Stephen Miller. Now, Stephen Miller, he's an America First guy. I mean, this is not a person who's going to want to immerse United States in any international conflicts. He's a domestic affairs person. So if you put a domestic affairs person there, his perspective will be, hey, how can we wrap this up, stop wasting our time, and then we can deal with the innumerable domestic problems that America faces and Trump's ambitious domestic agenda, which is where Miller's interest lies. So I don't know, but Trump said, "Hey, I think Miller is a strong candidate for national security advisor." So I don't think Rubio is going to be holding that position for long. I think it was just Waltz had to be kicked out, and there was nobody immediately to take over. So he gave it to Rubio, but I don't think Rubio is going to keep that position for long.
Yeah, we'll see what he does. I'm curious to see who his pick is and how that proceeds. But I always appreciate you taking the time to join me to break down all of the latest here. George Samiely, author, geopolitical analyst, and senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Always good to see you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also catch Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.